So, in the last two videos and the audio, we had actually briefly moved into discussing the different kinds of feminisms, for example, postmodern feminism, lesbian feminism, etc. And today we'll be moving on to the three waves of feminism. Now, before moving on to the three waves of feminism, I would like to talk briefly about certain discussions in the field of literature when it comes to feminist writings. And I would like to introduce two feminist writers. One is Elaine Showalter and the other is Turtle Moy. Elaine Showalter, in a literature of their own, actually inaugurated what later became the three phases of feminisms. And she kind of tried to do it in feminist literature as such. She said there is actually a phase called the feminine phase, wherein women were imitating the man's writing style, and largely they wrote under pseudonyms. Then in the feminist phase, women writers were criticizing the roles and characters which were ascribed to women from or by men and society in general. And then in the female phase, they were talking about establishing a female literary tradition of their own, wherein you have largely what you call the gynocriticism, which talks about a female literary tradition, female subjectivity, and female language. So this was actually something which she talks more about in her essay towards a feminist poetics. Now there was another feminist who actually could not really stand this particular female phase which was being discussed by Elaine Showalter, and that was Toril Moy. And Toril Moy, in one of her essays, Feminine, Feminist, and Female, criticized Showalter's ideas of female phase. She said that in a post structuralist era, there is no fundamental female self as such. So, trying to ascribe female phase was actually trying to go against the very principle that self is actually divided, identities are multiple. And so, she was actually somebody who could not really appreciate what Elaine Showalter was trying to talk about. Fiona Turlin, in her essay Feminisms, opined that feminism should be understood as a discussion of multiple related ideas. Now, this doesn't mean that feminism lacks a grounding or a standpoint. It just means that feminism and its arguments are not stagnant but open to voices and revision. The word wave signifies such an open ended movement. So, we'll be briefly moving on to the three waves and even the fourth wave, which has come up, and briefly discussing the salient features of each wave. Now, when you go through the waves, please try to understand that this doesn't mean that the first wave was something which happened in a particular timeline and which would not repeat in the next timeline. Whatever features you find in the first wave, you may find it in the third wave too. Whatever you find in the third wave, you may find it in the fourth wave too, which is why Fiona Turlin said that feminisms, when you try to understand feminisms, you should try to understand it as a discussion of multiple related ideas and not simply stagnant philosophical thoughts. Now, in the 19th and early 20th centuries in US and UK, feminists started protests and rallies claiming equality, property rights, and voting rights. An important text of the time, Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, which came out in 1929, highlighted the importance of women's financial independence and also, to a certain extent, opened the question of a gendered language, which led to Dale Spender, Helen Sissou, and Julia Kristeva's notions on language later. Then the second wave is actually something which happened in the 1960s and 70s, and a seminal text of this time was Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, 1949, which exposed how one becomes the second in the hierarchy, biologically, psychologically, historically, and culturally, when you take into consideration gender relations. And she inaugurated the becoming or the construction of femininity phase, one of the key arguments of the second wave. It was also an era which declared the personal as political. The second wave feminists criticized the public private division, which excluded women from public spheres. And they also deemed that private issues like marriage, childbirth, domestic violence, etc., were not matters fit enough to be discussed in public. They said reproductive rights, contraception, rape, then marital rape, they were all to be openly debated and discussed. It was also a phrase, the personal is political. That phrase was actually something which was popularized by Carol Hanisch in her essay, and it was actually a phrase which was highly figured in black feminism. Kate Millett, in her Sexual Politics, which came in 1969, suggested the power structures in man woman relationship. She dealt with four men writers to show how women characters and their representation is political. She talked about the writings of D.H. Lawrence, Norman Mailer, Henry Miller, and Jean Genet. And like the Bois, Millet also commented on how such constructed images of women were imbibed by women themselves. Now, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique talked about the problem of many of the housewives, the happy ones of the 20th century. And here we find in this, with the second wave, the space between the political and the personal thinning down, which actually moved into the third wave. Now that is Betty Friedan, right at the front, leading a protest during the 1960s and 70s. Now, before moving on to the third wave, I guess we have to touch a bit on the essentialist and the anti-essentialist debate, which was becoming prominent. Now, Fiona Tolan places Debois in the midpoint between the second wave and the first wave. Kate Millett, Debois, and many of the second wave feminists are largely anti essentialists who believe that gender differences were socially constructed. Now, Shulamit Firestone, in her Dialectic of Sex, which came in 1970, advocated artificial gestation, and she tried to break the binaries in such a manner. Now, the essentialists, on the other hand, celebrated the inherent connection of the female body with nature, with art, with writing. Now, Mary Daly, even while criticizing religion, law, and science, which were largely social constructs, celebrated the connections between body and nature. Helen Sissu's Écriture Feminine, which we had already discussed, mentioned in one of those previous videos, established the relation between the body of women and women's writing. So, essentialists basically celebrate the femaleness of the body and they do not negate its possibilities. Thus, lactating, childbirth, menstruation, they are all to be appreciated. And Écriture Feminine became the non-linear, elliptical, partly mythic writing which actually upsets the phallocentric order, the objective knowledge, logic, and rules. So, this is largely the essentialist and the anti-essentialist debates within feminist criticism, which I guess one should be aware of. Moving on to the third wave, which started in the 1990s, women from other communities, I mean, other than the middle class white community, found themselves to be largely alienated from the entire movement. While all women fought for body rights, black women felt that they should fight against forced sterilization of people of color and people with disabilities. Now, Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality talks about how different forms of oppression intersects. So, third wave feminists were largely dependent on Judith Butler's gender performativity, and third wave also took in the girl power movements, which was trying to embrace the girlishness, which the second wave feminists had actually largely ignored or had turned down. For example, the word girl itself is actually used by the third wave feminists to kind of celebrate the very identity of being called a girl. Now, Rebecca Walker is considered to be the person who actually used third wave for the first time. Now, there is even a fourth wave, which is largely, to a certain extent, that which advocates feminism, which is happening online. Now, sex positive, trans inclusive, body accepting, and digitally driven. That is what online feminism is all about. For example, you can consider the #Me Too movement, which happened quite in the past, as an example for the fourth wave feminism. Now, there is a networked feminism, that is, feminist responses to sexist, racist, and other discrimination with online mobilization and social networking. Again, the breastfeeding campaign in Kerala can be considered as an example here. Jessica Valenti is actually the person who, or is supposed to be the person who used this term, fourth wave, for the first time. Now, I guess we should really wind up today's video, and in the next video, we'll be looking into Bell Hooks's essays, especially postmodern blackness and marginality as site of resistance. Thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned. Good day.